What is the answer to which question? That one? Well, we're going to look at that a little bit more here. So, oil is a pretty darn important resource in the United States and around the world for that matter. So, when oil prices went up, what happened to the price level and real GDP? So on your model, on your graph, you know what, why don't we have all you guys come up a little closer since we got a small class. I think there might be some extra credit today for attendance since it's Friday and it doesn't look like we have kind of a full crew today, so we'll get you up all nice and tight. So let's have an extra credit quiz. So, Caleb and Chad, you guys can email me yours, okay? Yeah, piece of paper, pull out a fresh, clean sheet of paper. And here's your question. What happens to the price level and real GDP when the economy is hit with a negative oil price shock? Basically, it's the same problem we left off with last time. So, to do this problem, I'll give you a little bit more information. Draw a home base. Oops, that is not quite home base here. I had my micro brain on for a second.
You want us to draw this?
Yes. So draw this on your papers. You guys can hold your papers up to the monitor, but I want to see your papers, but you don't have to email that, but I do want to see your graph. So I'm not going to say anything more, and you guys can work together as one big group. What happens to the price level and real GDP when the economy is hit with a negative oil price shock? And this is short run only. So this is the short run, kind of the initial effect. Some of you had it correct on your papers. You can talk. I'm not going to say another thing. For the next 30 seconds, you've got to have the answer. We're turning these in 30 seconds. Go. Five seconds, and you're going to have to turn them in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, turn them in. We got 10 seconds to turn them in. This is completely extra credit. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, So did you guys email? I guess you didn't get the benefits of me. I went around and I was giving thumbs up and was telling them what to do. So what happened to the price level? It goes up. Real GDP. All right, let's see your papers, guys. I should have came over here. Caleb, you need to shift that short run aggregate supply. I was hoping that there would be more talking that you guys could cheat, so I'm going to cheat for you. And let's see yours, Chad. So no, don't move aggregate demand. So email me right now, increase the price level and decrease real GDP. All right. And then you can watch this as we do the graph here. So now redraw this on your regular notes. Or you can, if you had it correct on your notes from yesterday, I want to work through this. This is what it looked like all of you had that I ran around with the thumbs up. So there's the oil price shock. What kind of gap was opened up? What kind of gap was opened up? A recessionary gap, right? So real GDP is below. If real GDP, if we're over on this side of potential, what did we call it? An inflationary gap. Yeah, so that's just kind of our output gap is what it's referred to. And so here we have the price level climbing, real GDP falling. On our checklist of important things, how are we doing on our 3 goals? Goal number 1 is what? Increasing real GDP, right? And number 2 is low unemployment. And number 3 is low stable inflation. How are we doing with this situation? How's number 1 looking? Suck. Number 2. Number 2 is a little trickier, but suck, right? If there's less output, there's less jobs, right? So unemployment moves negatively or positively with output. Unemployment, as output falls, unemployment goes up. Negative or positive relationship between those 2 variables? Negative. When they're moving in opposite directions, we got a negative relationship. So as output starts to grow, unemployment starts to fall. So it moves the opposite direction, right? Okay, so there's our spot. This particular situation is not a good one. And we have kind of a combination of a couple words that we'll throw in with this. Stagnation. Stagnation is a term that we have for real GDP being too low. So lower than potential. So the current level of real GDP is less than its potential level. Stagnation. And of course, we all know what inflation is. Inflation is a period of rising prices, right? And here we've got both. So we call it stagflation sometimes. So this plus this gives us stagflation, just kind of a play on words. Both sucking at real GDP and sucking at the price level. We got 2 sucks against us, and that's not good. So a negative resource price shock like oil is not a good situation to be in. Okay, where is the economy headed towards? Where is the economy headed towards without any naturally anyway, without any government intervention, if we just let that old invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about, where is the economy headed towards? Back to A, that's right. So remember, your eyeball is always gravitating to where aggregate demand intersects long-run aggregate supply is where the economy is going to gravitate to naturally. The current state of the economy is given by the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And in this case, we have a recessionary gap. And so the natural way the economy would adjust back would be to come back to point A. And there would be a little bit of deflation to come back to A. And so this is where we get into the debate of should we stimulate the economy to pull us out, which is going to be, what's it going to do to our situation if we increase government spending, for instance? Yeah, it'll come up here, right? And so as we start to do that activity, it would push us up to here. How are we doing on our checklist, though? We're improving here if we do indeed move along there, but we've got further inflation. So that's not good. So there's this trade-off when we're in that particular area that makes it a little more difficult to figure out what policy might be a good one to pursue. All right. So I've got a little video today that we're going to watch. And it's a little bit, I guess, stuffy because it does deal with two economists. One is Keynes, who we've talked about. Does anybody remember what Keynes was interested, or what prescriptions he had for the economy? Big government, government spending, right? And so we try to get the government involved. And then the other guy, I think I mentioned one time early on, but we haven't really come back to him, and his name was Hayek, Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek and Keynes had a lot of battles back in the 40s. Kind of a weird time frame for the United States, of course, coming out of the Depression, and then we jump into World War II. And quite frankly, we had the chance of moving towards a more communist type system, or socialist anyway. And so what's the idea of communism versus socialism? Who wants to take a stab at that? It's not the easiest thing to grab onto, but I think it's kind of important in this history that how things evolved, especially with Keynes and Hayek. So what do you know about communism? Who's your favorite communist leader? Stalin. All right, so Stalin was one. We had Fidel Castro down in Cuba. So the idea of communism is that everything's owned by the government for the most part, and so it's very centrally planned, and they figure out what to do with resources and what to make and how to make them, right? So we have the dictator who's kind of controlling virtually all of the resources. In socialism, the government takes control of usually major industries. And so in more socialist countries, they might run healthcare, for instance. Instead of having private doctors, it might be the government running it. And the government controls the oil industry maybe, or the trucking and rail industry, transportation. So when the socialist idea is more of, well, let's let the government own the big stuff and then let people run their own little small businesses. So it's kind of a mixed bag that moves that direction. All right, and then capitalism is something that would be really fun to try in the United States sometime, but we're not quite pure capitalists. We're really in what's called maybe more of a mixed capitalist system, where the government still plays a pretty big role. When you've got the government spending being 20% of real GDP, you know, they're kind of playing a significant role there. So as opposed to maybe a smaller government's still needed, no doubt, but other places have smaller regimes where we allow more freedom for individuals to make those choices. So that's kind of capitalism. Communism would be at the other end, somewhere in between if we kind of give it a try. See if we can get this thing working here. All right, let me get this up, down. Hopefully you guys should be able to see okay. You can see that screen pretty good? Is it perfect or should I dim a light? I might dim a light anyway. Let me just make sure it doesn't screw up those guys' view. Oh yeah, now we're ready. Here we go, some stuffy econ stuff.
Lord Keynes, welcome, sir. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine.
Your agenda.
That won't be necessary. I have the agenda. Tell them I've arrived. And then tell them I've arrived.
And your name is?
Hayek. F.A. Hayek. Thank you. Freddie.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, party at the Fed.
Alright. 20 minutes.
Lobby. John Maynard Keynes.
F.A. Hayek.
Yeah, we're opposed.
We oppose each other philosophically.
In the same studio.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it. Plain old interest rates.
It's the animal spirit.
John Maynard Keynes wrote the book on modern macro. The man you need when the economy's on track. Depression, recession. Now your question's in session. Have a seat and I'll school you in one simple lesson. Boom, 1929, the big crash. We didn't bounce back, economies in the trash. Persistent unemployment, the result of sticky wages. Waiting for recovery, that's outrageous. I had a real plan, any fool can understand. The advice real simple, who's having it demand? C-I-G, altogether gets to Y. Keep that total growing, watch the economy fly. We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it. Plain old interest rates.
It's the animal spirit. You see, it's all about spending. Hear the register cha-ching. Circular flow, the dough is everything. So if that flow is getting low, doesn't matter the reason. We need more government spending. Now it's stimulus season, so forget about saving. Get it straight out of your head. Like I said, in the long run, we're all dead. Savings is destruction, that's the paradox of thrift. Don't keep money in your pocket or that growth will never live. Because business is driven by the animal spirits, the bull and the bear. And there's reasons to fear its effects on capital investment, income, and growth. That's why the state should fill the gap with stimulus, both the monetary and the fiscal. They're equally correct. Public works, digging ditches, war has the same effect. Even a broken window looks like last man has some wealth. The multiplier driving higher the economy's health. And if the central bank's interest rate policy takes a liquidity trap, that new money stuck in the banks, deficits could be the cure you've been looking for. Let the spending soar, now that you know the score. My general theories made quite an impression. Revolution, transform the econ profession. You know me, modesty, still I'm taking it back. So say it loud and say it proud, we're all Keynesians now.
We've been going back and forth for a century. I want to steer markets. I want them set free. There's a boom and bust cycle and the reason to fear it.
that kind of tees up the battle that we're facing, that we're looking at. Questions or comments on the video? What do you think? What was Hayek's points versus Keynes?
All the stimulus will lead to a bust.
Okay, so all the stimulus would lead to a bust. In what way? So if we think about it here, what's going on with our picture if we continue to stimulate the economy? So let's say we're in a long-run equilibrium for starters, and we say, hey, I got an idea, let's stimulate the economy. Right? So we'd have stuff like increased government spending. What else? For stimulating the economy, having the government steer, as he was saying, I want to steer markets. Inflation through monetary policy, right? So we got monetary policy that can push out aggregate demand, drop interest rates maybe, and have people get more loans. All right, what was the thing with taxes? What would be a stimulating type of thing to do? Lower taxes, right? So all of these tend to come up here. And so what Hayek's argument is that the government can stimulate all they want, but where do we head back to ultimately? Where do we head back to? Where is the economy headed in this picture? The intersection of what? The long-run aggregate supply curve and the new aggregate demand curve, right? So Hayek's argument is this, that you can go buy weapons of mass destruction and cause some distortions. Remember, we only go out this way when what's held constant? Resource prices, right? So we're kind of shocking the system, holding resources constant, but eventually those resources prices are going to change, and we're going to move from point A to C, was the diagrams we've been looking at. And so ultimately, the bust part is that we don't get anything real happening here. It just ends up being inflationary. Now, there's a small caveat to that, and that is it depends on what the government's spending their money on. If the government is spending money on something that makes people more productive, like roads and bridges, maybe internet, transportation systems, if they're spending money on something that makes people more productive, maybe there's a chance there that could be expansionary for the long-run aggregate supply curve. Because what shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve?
Increase in technology.
Technology, good. So the same things that shifted the production possibilities frontier outward, technology was one of them. What else was a shifter of the production possibilities frontier, which is also the same as our shifter list for long-run aggregate supply? Quantity of capital, quantity of labor. So basically our resource base is ultimately what drives real GDP. And so I like to think of it back to the bucket theory, where we've only got so much stuff, so many resources. Ultimately, the potential output for the economy of all the stuff we like to enjoy, the stuff on the shelves at Walmart, comes from our resource base. So if the government is indeed spending G on something that is in some way, shape, or form a resource, then maybe that has a little bit of merit. So is the government really efficient with their spending? What stories have you heard? Are they real careful with where they spend their money?
Well, just like in that article you sent us the other day about how you work for the government and kind of steer away around like paying taxes.
Okay, so yeah, possibly you might be able to change some laws to your benefit. That's possible. So why is the government perhaps not as efficient with spending as opposed to a corporation?
They're nonprofit, they don't have to make a profit.
Okay, they don't have to make a profit. The government doesn't have to make a profit. So the profit motive ends up being a thing that keeps business people in check, right? That they want to minimize costs. The government, on the other hand, when costs go up, what do they do? Or what do they pledge for? More borrowing or increased taxes, right? So we end up having this, there's a big difference between, and that's why I wanted to kind of tie this back to the socialist idea and why most Americans, I don't think, will ever go, hopefully, to a real socialist type system where the government controls some of these big industries, because they won't do it as efficiently because the incentives just aren't right. That's part of what keeps those businesses in check, is that they might have zero profits and they might be driven out of business with healthy competition. So the whole system's a little bit different. We tend to get maybe a little sloppy in our, because some people have never had an economics course, they might start to think, well, the government can just do it for us. That would be a great idea, and then we can just kick back. But the government won't do things typically as efficiently as a business would. Some things we can't run a business with, though, like national defense. As an economist, I often like to think, why are we having the government run this? Could we do it ourselves? So could we run national defense as a private company? Are there any examples where we have defense of some sort being done by private individuals?
Like private security.
Yeah, private security here on campus, right? We have our tough and rumble guys that protect us here on the OU campus. Ottawa University hires those people. We're running our own defense, essentially, right? So could we all just do that in national defense? And we run into problems because of what economists call the free rider problem, is that somebody, if the nation's protected and McCullough's not paying his taxes, then they can't tell the terrorists to go ahead and bomb McCullough, but don't touch his neighbor or I'll kill you. Right? That just doesn't work as a pay-as-you-go system. So there are some goods, what economists call public goods, which we talk about in micro class and less so here. But public goods are not government-provided goods. They're goods that have some special characteristics. In national defense, I won't get into the details of those, but we'll save that for micro class. But those are goods that the government does provide and supply for good reasons, because the market couldn't do it. The situation's not right to have a private business do it. Okay, so questions or comments? So on the Hayek type people, we get this result. Keynes' rebuttal back to that is that in the long run, we're all dead. Did you hear that in the video? In the long run, we're all dead. So let's do some action in between. And so that is part of the argument. The classical economists like Hayek would make this type of argument. I got both golf clubs today, so this is pretty interactive graphing here. So is it realistic that resource prices are fixed? Do we ever really move to B? No, right? It's part of the economic model here that we maybe move from A to B, assuming resource prices are fixed. But what's really happening is that these are moving simultaneously together. So as government stimulates this thing, resource prices are starting to adjust too. And so the real path that the economy takes would more likely be something like a curved line or something up to C. Right? As both curves are shifting at the same time, we'll move from A to C. Keynes still makes the argument that that's too long, but economists like Hayek say that markets would adjust fairly quickly and we don't need to. We'll explore that topic later, but I just kind of wanted to put that in your head as we start to get a little bit deeper into these opposing viewpoints. All right, so we're going to dig deeper into the Keynes model in this next chapter. So your material for this Sunday is chapter 10 only, and we're done with that. So we're going to we do 11 and 12 next week. And so we're going to start chapter 11 right now, and they kind of relate to each other anyway. So this will be a good time to do it. So let's just put here chapter 11. This is a chapter that describes the Keynesian theory. And in a nutshell, spending is the focus. As we saw in the video, spending is the focus. And we can stimulate or muffle, I'm trying to think of a good word here for stimulate or muffle the economy with government policy. And then I want to kind of highlight here that many economists disagree. And so this topic really brings up a hotly debated issue in economics, to the point of maybe sometimes people screaming at each other in the past of what we should do, because they're really different from each other. So we're going to talk first, to build up this model, about the consumption function. So we're going to think a little bit harder about consumption. So recall, and we're going to talk a lot about cigarettes, because this was the expenditure approach to measuring real GDP. So y equals c plus I plus g plus x. Since this theory focuses on spending, we'll kind of think a lot about this formula and the effects of spending this way. Or it'll be kind of characterized that way. Okay, so we're going to look at consumption in a little more detail. Let's look at the consumption function. Consumption function. 1, 2. They still do that one? Did you guys do that in Sesame Street? They still got the... It's not consumption function, but it's, what is it? I can't remember. Conjunction junction? Conjunction, is it conjunction function? Conjunction function. Yeah, that's why putting words together, right? Was it? Okay. So this is a consumption function. And we're going to put our equation goggles on for starters here and look at the consumption here this way. So I want you to think about how you consume goods, right? What is this equation stating? What's this? Real GDP, or I want to think about it maybe a little bit differently. You can think about it, you're correct, it is real GDP, but if we're talking about your consumption and a consumption function, what's another good way to think about it? As your income, right? So remember, it's also the income for the nation. And so we're thinking about how much of our income gets devoted to consumption. And it turns out to be quite a bit of it for the United States. We learned in chapter 7 that we don't do a lot of savings. So this little b is a big number, but it's a big number that's less than 1. So it's the fraction of our income that goes towards consumption. What is the A in this equation? What is it telling you? The A. We got consumption is partially based on our income because we spend a fraction of our income to go towards consumption. What would A be? Not taxes. In fact, by the way, I was going to put here, we're going to assume that there's no taxes. Technically, this would be disposable income, but just kind of, let's assume no tax for now. What is this little A guy? Are you guys able to consume even if you didn't make any money this year? Yeah. How do you get that money? Loans. What else? How else do you spend money? So loans would be a good one. Credit. I like loans. I like free money better. What do you call free money? Gifts, right? So there's a chunk of consumption that does not depend on income. In fact, it might have been from previous income, i.e. your savings. So if we're looking at your consumption this year, part of that consumption could be coming from savings that you had from a previous year, plus the amount of money that you made this year. And we're going to keep it nice and simple, that's it. And we're going to call this the autonomous part of consumption. Autonomous part of consumption. So this little thing here is a number that represents autonomous consumption. And one way to think about it is just consumption that does not depend on your income. So it's all other things that are outside of income, whatever those happen to be. It is consumption that does not depend on income. My income this year, autonomous consumption. B is the fraction of my income that goes towards consumption, and we call that the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. So B is the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. And it is the fraction of income used for consumption. And this, of course, is our income. Label that. That's our income. So if A equals 100 and the marginal propensity to consume equals 0.9, the fraction of our income equals 0.9, what is the consumption function? What is the C function? So plug and chug for me. Just bear with me because I want to make sure, again, might be a useful time for you to write it down without just copying me. But go ahead and write the function. You might see this in a homework problem or something. So if the autonomous part of consumption is $100 and the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, what is the consumption function? So all I'm asking you to do is to rewrite this, plugging these numbers in. Everybody write it down. I'm going to come around and check your papers. Why don't you point to it on your paper so I know you got it done. Okay, good, good. Good. Zach, you didn't do it yet? Not yet. I want to see everybody's paper. You're not quite there yet. You're not quite there. So follow it exactly. C equals. Good. So Riley's got it. You can have Riley show you. Zach, got it? 100 plus. Good, 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 and good. Okay? Point to your papers for me. See, good, good. Okay, good. Now, what's that? I didn't give you y. Yeah, and that's the whole purpose here. Now, if you look closely at that, some of you who are a little more mathematically inclined, that equation has a special form, doesn't it? What is the form of this equation? Slope-intercept form, right? Y equals mx plus b. So the next thing I want to do is graph it with C on the vertical axis. With C on the vertical axis. So switching to our equation goggles, we're measuring simply income on the horizontal axis, C on the vertical axis. And if income is 0, how much is consumption still? If income is 0, 100, right? So plot that point, 100. Now, you don't have to get exact detail here on the rest of it, but what is the slope of the line? 0.9. If we think in terms of rise over run, how would you do it? 9 over 10 would work, right? Rise 9, run 10. So those of you with the rise over run concept. So we've got a slope that runs at a 0.9, whatever we can be a little bit sloppy here, but we got something that looks like this. 0.9y, there's our function. If my income was $1,000, what would my consumption be? Careful. If my income was $1,000, what would my consumption be? 1,100, right? Or 1,000? 900, I heard? 1,000. All right, so at $1,000 worth of income, graphically, I'd go up to my consumption function, hang a left, and if we drew this all nicey-nicey to scale, I'd have 1,000 here, which is simply just 900 plus the autonomous part is 100. 100 plus 900 equals 1,000. All right. So that's our problem. If the United States got saving more and the marginal propensity to consume changed to 0.8, what would happen to the slope of the consumption function? Flatten out, right? So if this turned out to be a 0.8, right? So we got that angle here kind of changing, and that's going to lead to some different results. All right, so now what we're going to do is kind of blow up that concept into all aggregate expenditure. And so the aggregate expenditure model is really this Keynesian multiplier model. So aggregate expenditure model, the AE model. So aggregate expenditure is total planned spending. And it has two parts to it. One is the expenditure that is induced. I left my black pencil. Oh, thank you. Other one's running dry. I need to get black paint. That's what I need to do. Looks like this one's not going to be any better. So we've got two types of planned expenditure. So let's just put two types. One is induced expenditure. And this is spending that does not vary, or I'm sorry, spending that varies with income. Ultimately, for this model, that is consumption, which is our C from our cigarettes, and imports. We don't want to forget about our net exports is exports minus imports. I guess I've been doing IM for that. Imports. Purchases that we made from the rest of the world. So we can also kind of think of our marginal propensity to import goods. But that's our induced expenditure. When my income goes up, I buy more American goods, and I buy more foreign goods too. Okay? So induced expenditure. The other type is autonomous expenditure. We just looked at autonomous consumption, and now we're going to generalize that to autonomous expenditure. And that's simply spending that does not vary with income. Spending that does not vary with income. For this model, so one key point here, it's an assumption. For this model, we're going to have investment be autonomous. What is investment again? Share Google stock, mutual funds, 401ks, all that kind of stuff. Capital purchases, right? So purchases of machines, buildings, all that stuff. In econ class, when we think of investment in macro class, we're thinking about that stuff. And we're going to say that that does not vary on our income, which is a bit of an assumption. Maybe it does to some degree, but investment choices also would be driven by profit motives and other things. So the level of investment in the society we're going to have as autonomous. Government spending. Government spending, which is our G in our cigarettes. And then finally, our exports. What other nations buy from us depends on their own income, but not ours, right? So autonomous exports. Our exports will be treated as autonomous. And then the last one, remember we had a little a from the autonomous part of consumption. So we have little a equaled autonomous part of consumption. So there's 4 things that we're going to have separated that way. All right, so what does this sucker look like? We can kind of think about coming over here. I'll redraw it in a second, but if we look at your graph that you have here, if I add investment to the economy, and investment is autonomous, so now instead of just looking at my expenditure with consumption only, if I now add I onto it, what happens to this graph? It goes up, right? So if we add $50 worth of investment, then this would shift up by, oops, I don't want this graph, by 50 units. And then what would happen to the slope? What would happen to the slope? Nothing, right? So the autonomous part, if we look at C plus I, where we've added $50 worth of investment now to our economy, that would shift up by the 50. And if I now add government spending onto it to some amount, and that spending is autonomous, what happens to the function again? It goes up again by the amount of that, whatever that was. So maybe this goes up by 200 units. We got the government involved now. C plus I plus G. All right, then we're gonna, for now, we're gonna leave it as a what we call a closed economy. I'm not gonna bring in exports, the rest of the world. So sometimes we say, suppose we have a closed economy where there's no imports or exports, then our total spending would just be the cig rather than the cigarettes, C plus I plus G. And we're going to measure total expenditure on the vertical axis. So the aggregate expenditure model, planned spending, looks like this. And we'll just do the C plus I plus G. And over here, we're measuring income. So one thing to remember now, this is planned spending. what we plan to spend, given by the aggregate expenditure line. Now, in equilibrium, what we produce, the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries over the course of the year. So now I'm going to flip on you. I've been telling you to think of it as income, but now I want you to think more of it as production. And think about this being the production of goods, right? So what we're going to do is start to think about production versus spending. And in equilibrium, the amount we produce should be equal to the amount we spent. You with me? So if the economy is operating in what we call an equilibrium, what we spent is what we made, right? What was spent is what we made. What line would show points where this is equal to this? If you were to draw, if that's my challenge to you, draw a line that shows all possible points where income or production is equal to planned spending. Where would it be? Along the line? Kaylee, where would that be? Where would it start? Start it at 0 and then do what? Go 1 to 1, right. So we call that the 45-degree line because we're going to use it as a reference. I didn't do very good 45 degrees. You guys do better than I just did. That's probably the worst 45-degree line I've ever done. So try to split these two. Maybe that's a little bit better. The 45-degree line. We're calling it that because it's really just a reference line. It is where we'd expect to be in equilibrium, where production equals spending. So where the two lines cross seems to be where all the action is in economics, right? At this point, we've got the level of production equal to the amount of spending. All right, so questions on the setup so far. So this is the aggregate expenditure line that has some slope to it. That's what we'd expect to be in the long run, having those two things equal to each other. All right, so what? Well, what happens if we're not in equilibrium? What happens if we're at an output level that's less than that long run point? So let's take a point here. Y, I'm going to make it kind of obnoxious here because it doesn't matter as long as we're to this direction. If we look at Y2, what's happening in the economy? So we got spending greater than production. So spending greater than production. What's happening to inventories on the shelves at Walmart? What's happening to the inventories of final goods? They're starting to go down. And when inventories start to fall, what does Walmart do? They start producing more, get more calls out to their distributors, right? We start to ask for more to fill up the shelves. And so if we were at a level that was too low, we'd have inventories declining, which would signal to businesses to ramp up production so that they don't run out of inventory. So at Y2, we've got this vertical distance here. That vertical height tells us the amount of dollars that we're short. We've got spending greater than our income. So at Y2, planned spending is greater than production. Now here I'm using the production word because I think in my brain it works a little better. How can we spend more than what we're currently producing? We've got now inventories of goods as catching some of that slack. So this vertical distance here is representing the amount of what's happening to inventories. So inventories, this implies that inventory of final goods and services is falling. So inventory of final goods and service is falling. That signals producers to increase production. So we're going to move this direction. So what we're kind of doing is justifying why we think we'll be here in the long run. And we're introducing a new concept that we haven't talked a lot about, and that's inventories of final goods and services. Inventory falls into the investment category, is where it was on our spending. So our consumption is actually buying and consuming those final goods and services when we make the purchase by households. And if there are stockpiles of inventories, that's included as part of the investment category. The firm is holding those inventories. If we're someplace over here at Y3, spending is lower. Here's AE3. I guess I didn't put in AE2, did I? Spending is lower than production. How do I know that that's true? How are you using the model to know that? It's below the 45-degree line. So that's how we're using the 45-degree line, is that we know that spending is less than what it would be in equilibrium because of the 45-degree line. The 45-degree line kind of helps us eyeball what's going on. And so here we'd have increasing inventories. As Walmart starts to have stockpiles of goods and services, they call up their manufacturer and say, cut back on production, right? And so we're going to be moving this direction if we have production higher than where we'd be in equilibrium. So at Y3, aggregate expenditure is less than our production, and inventory is rising. So that's not a stable position to be in, which means producers are going to cut back on production. So that signals, inventories are a signals to producers to decrease production. Now, a couple things to point out here before we get into this multiplier business. The slope of this line is equal to the marginal propensity to consume. So the slope is equal to the marginal propensity to consume. The way we have it drawn here. All right, so let's do a little example of a shock to the system here. Does anybody have any questions so far? I know it kind of takes a little bit to tee this one up. So let's do an example. Suppose, oh, this one's totally dead. I'm going to have to stick with, I think my blues are getting a little too. I like blue stands out pretty good. All right. So suppose that there's an increase of G equal to 50. Now if we bring G in, is G autonomous or induced spending? What kind of thing is G? So this could be, it's autonomous. Yep, it was one of our autonomous lists. So in other words, it doesn't depend on income. Obama decides to buy some weapons to kill ISIS, for example. Right? So we're going to have an autonomous injection, if you will, into the economy. What is the effect of that change in spending? So let's track it through. If there's $50 increase in G, let's see. What happens to that money? We've talked about this a little bit before. What happens to that money? So Obama says we're going to buy some weapons of mass destruction. Go kill those ISIS dudes. What happens to the 50? What's that? It enters the market, right. So if we think back to the big picture here and try to visualize the flow, we've got, let's see, I want my government one. Here we go. Out of nowhere, we've got some G happening, and Obama cuts a check to Guns R Us, a company that's over here, right? What happens to the money from there? Maybe to the bank, but we're not telling a monetary kind of call here, but it's close. Where does that 50 million go? So here it is. Obama signs a check, boom, 50 million in the cash register. Now where does it go? Some of it goes back to the households. How about how much of it? So some of it goes to some paychecks, right? What else is going on at the weapons company? So they got production. What else do they buy with the 50 million? Let's be a little weapons, like resources like what? Let's try to tell a little story so we got this infused in our head. Raw materials. some of their suppliers, right? Raw metals, the bullets. They got the ammo guy that we have to pay off, right? Employees. That money is all, every penny of it is the story we told before. Every penny of that is getting allocated somehow to resources to make those weapons. So it turns out to be income for somebody in one way, shape, or form. So the autonomous spending leads to income. So the increase in G of 50 leads to an increase in income of 50. Paychecks, suppliers, blah, blah, blah. Somehow that 50 million gets allocated into income. What happens next? What are those people going to do with their paycheck? They're going to use it in some way, shape, or form. They're going to run to Walmart. They're going to go to Applebee's. How much of it are they going to consume? 90% or 80% or whatever it is, but the nation has an average of that amount equal to the marginal propensity to consume. So if the marginal propensity to consume was 80%, 0.8, how much of the 50 is being spent? I know I'm pushing your brains here on 40, right? So 10% of 50 is 5, 20% would be 10. So we've got that going on, that change in income kind of flows through a new part. I'm just going to kind of continue it like this, which then leads to spending of 40. And I don't even want to put the C, I guess, because we're telling a story of an individual getting their $50 paycheck. But it ultimately leads to more, well, we can do this. We can do the C. Of 40, which is the marginal propensity to consume times the income, with the marginal propensity to consume equal to 0.8. I didn't write that down yet. So they run to Walmart and spend 40 bucks. What does Walmart do with it? They deposit it. They ultimately use it for what? What does Walmart do with that 40 bucks? Inventory. They pay their suppliers. They pay their employees. That $40 ends up going into somebody else's paycheck as income. How much of that gets consumed? Careful. Now we're down to how much of that's going to turn into consumption? 32, right? 80% of the 40 now. So we've done the first round, if you will, the first round of spending looked like this. The second round looked like this. The third round, now we're down here. That money is going to go to another business and turn into an increase in consumption of 32. And so on, and so on, and so on. So we get the 32, and then we're down to 2560, and so on, and so on, and so on. So when the government chooses to buy the weapons of mass destruction, how much of an income effect did it have? on gross domestic product, on spending. How much did income change by? Something bigger, right? 50 plus 40 plus 32. So this is what we call the income multiplier effect. It's really the spending multiplier. So $50 worth of spending actually created more income because of the way it was rifled around. So let's play through again. We got Obama cutting the check to Guns R Us. Guns R Us pays its bills. Its employees go to Walmart. Walmart pays its bills, including its paychecks. And so there's this multiplying effect of money getting spent over and over and over. That was Keynes' concept of the spending multiplier. And it is similar to what we saw with the deposit multiplier. But that was different. That was the creation of money by money ending up in accounts. So don't be confused between those two things. They are distinct things. This one relates to spending and income. The other one related to how we hold our wealth with money, whether we hold it as currency or as a deposit. But we got the same type of thing kicking in. All right, so that process has a nice little formula to it. A nice little shortcut formula. And so in general, we're going to call this the autonomous spending multiplier. The autonomous spending multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And how this relates into this problem then is we want to think about, well, what is the final change in income for the economy? It is simply the multiplier times the change in government spending for this problem, the change in autonomous expenditure. So what's the multiplier for this problem where we had an MPC of 0.8? 1 over 2. But be careful, it's 1 over 1 minus 0.8. That's what I wanted to make sure it's not 80%. It is the fraction. So it is 0.8. And then my change in government spending was $50 million towards government weapons of mass destruction. So I get 1 over 0.2, which is 10 divided by 2 is 5. So if you do 1 over 0.2 times 50, you get 5 times 50 equals 250. So Obama spending $50 million leads to $250 million worth of new income. Sounds like a great deal, doesn't it? Okay. Questions there? One thing that you might see on your homework is that we could rewrite this formula or give you different information, and that is the marginal propensity to save. So if we're consuming 80%, how much are we saving? 20%, the other part, right? So we're either saving our income or we're consuming it. And so you could also write this formula as 1 over the MPS. I'm going to just write that as a separate note. Okay, so note the marginal propensity to save is equal to 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Let me just write it all out. The marginal propensity to save, the MPS, is just the balance of that fraction. The fraction of income that you're saving. So you might need to go back and forth on that one depending on what kind of information is on the question. Remember, this is all stuff for next week. It's not for this Sunday. Just bear that in mind. Hopefully you put chapter 11 on where we started this stuff. Okay, which would mean that the multiplier could be characterized as 1 over the MPS, which would work too. So therefore, multiplier can also be written as 1 over the MPS. Okay, so what happened graphically? What happened Oh, wait, one more thing I wanted to put here. This is kind of important. I'll come back to it later, but I want you to write it in your notes right now. This is the simple multiplier. The simple multiplier. And I'm going to complicate it later for you, not today, because I think we've had all we can digest at this point. But this is the simple spending multiplier, which is what you'll use on some of your homework too. What happened graphically? So I'm going to erase this. We want to keep this inventory business as kind of a separate deal. So showing the multiplier graphically, showing multiplier graphically. So we got a new kind of home base looking thing. We got the expenditures, and you can draw your 45-degree line, which is our reference. And then draw in any old, probably start low with it. Draw in your aggregate expenditure line. If we have an increase, let me let you guys get caught up here. If we have an increase in autonomous spending through this government injection, the way we've characterized it, what happens to this graph? It shifts up, right? So we have that parallel shift up. Same thing that we were doing before is we can take this and just for fun, let's have it shift up. It doesn't have to be up to this level, but make it a parallel shift like that. And you might put yourself a reminder, since we had G1 and G2 is the reason it shifted. That was the autonomous part of consumption that shifted. So we had a shift up, which we could look at on the vertical axis like we did before, but let me let you think about it this way. That the shift here was a $50 million bump up, right? Since it was a parallel shift, it's 50 down here. We have a change in government spending, triangle G, a change equal to 50. The very first round of spending, it went into weapons R Us pockets, and if we went rise over run 50-50, we'd end up here, right? I mean, that would be the 50 and then the 50. But it didn't. It went bigger. And so the new equilibrium point after we do that adjustment is up here to Y2. And so the final change in Y from that amount, our new equilibrium point is at something greater than 250. We went all the way over to here. We got 250 million with the change in Y. So the change, I'm getting a little small there. The change in Y equaled 250. And that was through it creating income from somebody else, and then it leads to further consumption. So graphically, this thing works out like this. 50 of spending leads to 250 of income in its final effect after all of the multiplication of spending goes through. Okay, questions or comments on that? That's kind of the basics so far. Let's put a 2 there. I think it's a good time to call it a day. Mark your calendars, you're getting out early today.